Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the dusty, forgotten corners of medieval life, where people had to do the most unglamorous jobs to keep society ticking. Picture the streets lit by flickering candles, the sound of boots echoing on cobblestone roads, and the faint scent of smoke in the air amongst the bustling trades. There were some professions so boring you'd wonder how anyone could have survived the sheer monotony. One of these professions, the humble chandler, yes, the person responsible for making candles. Sounds easy, right? Well, it wasn't. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is there. I always find it fascinating to know where everyone is watching. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The scribe's life. Imagine a time when books were precious and writing was a painstaking, tedious task. In the 12th century, before the printing press and digital texts, every manuscript was handwritten by someone often, someone you'd never hear about. But these scribes, while central to the preservation of knowledge, lived lives that would seem uneventful by modern standards. The scribe's day typically began before dawn, the pale light of morning casting soft shadows through a modest stone building. Often working in a monastery or a small scriptorium, these men and women were responsible for copying texts by hand, one letter at a time. Their tools were few: a quill, ink, and parchment. The parchment was costly, and waste was not tolerated. Writing, for a scribe, was not simply a job, but a slow, methodical craft that demanded precision and patience. The quill, dipped in ink, would glide across the parchment, its thin lines forming the words that had once been spoken but were now preserved for the future. The scribe would copy entire books, sometimes religious texts, sometimes scholarly works, or even mundane legal documents, each one requiring hours of concentrated effort. The act itself could seem trivial, almost mechanical, but it was a task that carried immense weight. The pages they wrote held knowledge, and in the absence of print, this was the only way information could be shared. What we consider as boring today, endlessly copying texts, was, in fact, an essential part of maintaining the continuity of knowledge during the medieval period. The life of a scribe was marked by routine. The day was spent sitting in a small, dimly lit room. The hours would slip by unnoticed, measured by the sound of quill on paper and the occasional murmur of other scribes working nearby. The scribe had little time for leisure or personal matters. The work required focus and the avoidance of distractions. The monk scribe, for example, would spend the hours between prayers hunched over his manuscript, often copying for days on end. A single page might take hours to complete, as each letter had to be formed carefully. Mistakes were not easily corrected. Each error might mean starting the entire line over again, leading to frustration and impatience. It was a profession that, to the modern eye, would appear monotonous, and yet, without it, the books that shaped Western thought, the religious texts that governed daily life, and the laws that held society together would have been lost. The scribes played an unnoticed yet crucial role in medieval life. They did not seek fame or recognition. They worked quietly in the background, shaping the future through their unglamorous labor. But did the scribe ever think about the impact of their work? Did they consider how, in a century or two, their painstakingly written pages would still be in the hands of future generations, cherished and read by scholars and students alike? The scribe may have thought little of this after all. There was no way to know that their work would endure. They were merely doing their job, living their life, and filling the pages of history. And as they worked, were they ever curious about the world outside, the world that was changing rapidly around them? Could they ever have known how their humble profession would be the foundation for the information revolution that would unfold centuries later? As the years passed, the profession of the scribe evolved, yet it remained fundamentally unchanged in its daily demands. The tools of the trade, while simple, were integral to the work, and the scribe's proficiency with these tools was what set them apart from others. To the modern mind, these tools may seem primitive, but in the medieval period, they were sophisticated instruments that required great skill to use effectively. The primary tool for a scribe was the quill. It was sourced from birds' geese, swans, and sometimes crows. A quill had to be carefully prepared before use. Its tip was sharpened into a fine point, allowing for the creation of delicate, uniform strokes. The ink, made from soot and water, mixed with other natural ingredients like gum arabic or oak gall, was stored in ink pots. The scribe would dip the quill into the ink and then make the slow, deliberate strokes that would form letters. It wasn't uncommon for a scribe to dip their quill into the ink every few words, depending on the length of the passage they were copying. In addition to the quill and ink, scribes relied heavily on parchment. Parchment was made from animal skins, typically from sheep, goats, or calves, and it was labor-intensive to prepare. The skin had to be scraped clean, stretched on a frame, and dried in the sun. It was then scraped again to smooth the surface, creating a sturdy yet flexible material that could hold the ink without bleeding. Parchment, while durable, was costly, and as such, a scribe had to be careful with every sheet they used. This led to a careful process of preparation. When a scribe began their work, they would often measure the space on the parchment to ensure the text would fit perfectly, leaving room for margins and making certain the lines were evenly spaced. Each page had to be crafted with precision, as any deviation from the norm was seen as an error. Even the smallest mistake, such as a misshaped letter or a smudge, could mean the scribe would have to start over, wasting precious resources and time. In some scriptoriums, scribes used ruled lines to guide their writing. These lines were faintly drawn with a lead stylus and would disappear once the ink was applied. The lines ensured that the text was uniform, helping to maintain order on the page. In addition to these lines, some scribes added illustrations or decorative initials, especially in religious texts. Illuminating these letters or pictures was a delicate art form in itself. It required a different skill set entirely, one that involved painting with gold, silver, and vibrant colors made from natural dyes. But while these tools might seem simple, they represented the cutting edge of medieval technology. There was no printing press yet, no mechanical way to reproduce books. The scribe's quill, ink, and parchment were the only means of copying knowledge. The act of writing was not only an intellectual exercise, it was a physical one as well. Scribes would often work for hours, their hands sore from holding the quill, their necks and backs stiff from sitting in the same position for long stretches of time. Despite this physical strain, the scribe remained relatively isolated. They rarely ventured outside the walls of their monastery or scriptorium. The work required their full attention, and in an age before clocks, time itself seemed to bend to the task at hand. Days blurred into nights, and seasons passed unnoticed as the scribe worked, never knowing how the pages they copied would shape the future. But what of the larger world outside the scriptorium? What did the scribe know of the politics of the time, or of the grand events that were unfolding across the globe? Did they hear whispers of the Crusades, or the growing tensions between kings and bishops? In their quiet, secluded life, the scribe had little connection to these events. They were a cog in a much larger machine, and their work, although essential, was an isolated task, one performed without fanfare or recognition. And yet, unbeknownst to them, these scribes were the silent keepers of knowledge. While kings and queens ruled and armies fought, the scribes toiled away, preserving the intellectual and spiritual heritage of their age. What would happen, though, if a catastrophe occurred, if these manuscripts were lost, or worse, destroyed? Would the work of generations be erased forever? By the 15th century, the scribe's world was beginning to change. The long-established methods of hand-copying texts had served society for centuries, but the advent of the printing press, introduced by Johannes Gutenberg around 1440, was about to render the scribe's painstaking work obsolete. This invention, which allowed for the mass production of books, would transform the entire landscape of knowledge and communication. The introduction of the printing press fundamentally altered the role of the scribe. No longer would texts have to be copied by hand, word by word, line by line. Instead, books could be printed in large quantities, and knowledge could be spread faster than ever before. The once vital profession of the scribe began to fade into obscurity. But what happened to those who had spent their lives in this humble, repetitive work? Were they simply forgotten? Their contributions to history overshadowed by the more dramatic shift in technology. In the immediate aftermath of the printing revolution, scribes found themselves in an uncertain position. Many lost their jobs as printing presses rapidly expanded and book production increased. The demand for hand-copied manuscripts diminished, and the once crucial skills of the scribe were no longer in high demand. However, some scribes adapted to the new world. They transitioned into other roles, some as editors, others as printers themselves, using the new technology to refine their craft. Those who were able to navigate the shift in technology found a way to remain relevant, even in this new age. But for many others, the transition was difficult. The idea of having a printing press in every town was foreign to the medieval mindset, and many were resistant to change. The quality and care of hand copying, which had once been seen as an art, seemed lost in the quick and mechanical processes of the press. The elegance and thoughtfulness of the scribe's work could not be replicated by the cold, metallic type of the printing press. Still, the legacy of the scribe endured. In the centuries that followed, scholars, historians, and even the general public would come to appreciate the significance of the manuscripts that had been carefully preserved by scribes over the centuries. These handwritten texts, though often seen as tedious to produce, contained ideas, stories, and information that would otherwise have been lost. The very idea that an individual could sit for hours, weeks, or even months copying an entire text, often in a dimly lit room, speaks to the devotion and patience of these workers. And it wasn't just the intellectual content of these manuscripts that carried weight. It was the very act of preserving knowledge in such a painstaking way that made these works so valuable. The scribe's labor, though invisible to most, was the bedrock upon which future generations would build. Without their careful transcription of religious texts, legal documents, scientific treatises, and even stories of daily life, the great intellectual revival of the Renaissance might not have been possible. These scribes laid the groundwork for the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and the modern age of knowledge. As we look back, it is easy to dismiss the life of a scribe as dull, repetitive, and insignificant. They were, after all, simply copying the work of others. But the quiet work of these scribes holds more significance than at first appears. It was their careful preservation of the past that allowed humanity to move forward. They were the silent custodians of knowledge, laboring in the background while the great events of history unfolded. And perhaps it is worth asking, if the printing press had never been invented, would the scribe have continued their quiet, essential work for centuries to come? Would they have been remembered as the true unsung heroes of history, the ones who kept the flame of knowledge burning, one carefully written page at a time? Their legacy is a reminder that even the most boring professions can have a lasting impact on the course of history, one that may not be immediately apparent, but whose ripple effects are felt for centuries. The fuller's work. In the medieval period, the tasks and trades that were integral to daily life often went unnoticed, especially those that involved the creation and maintenance of the clothes people wore. Among these forgotten professions was that of the fuller, a figure whose work was critical to the textile industry, yet one that seldom captured the imagination of history. The fuller was responsible for cleaning, thickening, and finishing woolen fabrics, transforming raw material into something useful and presentable. The fulling process began with the wool itself, which, before being woven into fabric, was rough and itchy. Wool was sheared from sheep, washed to remove grease and dirt, and then turned over to the fullers. Their task was to clean it further, felting the fibers together to create a dense, uniform fabric. To achieve this, the fuller used a combination of water, clay, and foot stomping. Yes, foot stomping. The fullers would take the woolen cloths and soak them in vats of water mixed with fuller's earth, a type of clay that had the property of absorbing grease and dirt. Once the fabric was wet, fullers would stand in the vats and stomp on the cloth, pounding it with their feet to work the fibers together. This process was both strenuous and dirty, involving long hours spent in water-filled vats that were often cold and uncomfortable. Yet, without this process, wool would remain rough and unpleasant to wear. The use of foot power may seem primitive, but it was an essential part of medieval fabric production. In some places, fullers used mechanical tools to aid the process, such as a water-powered mill, which could rotate large hammers to pound the cloth. In others, the fulling was done entirely by hand and foot. The fullers working in small, poorly lit workshops or along the edges of towns near water sources, the noise in the workshops, the constant rhythm of the workers' feet stamping, filled the air as they worked tirelessly to transform raw wool into something wearable. At first glance, the job of the fuller might seem like nothing more than a tedious, unglamorous chore, but it was, in fact, a critical part of the textile production chain. Without fulling, woolen fabric would never achieve the necessary texture or durability, and the fine cloths worn by the wealthier members of society would not exist. Fullers worked in tandem with weavers, dyers, and spinners, creating a tight knit network of artisans who worked to turn the raw materials of nature into the clothes that defined medieval life. For a fuller, the work was often physically exhausting and unpleasant. The wool would sometimes become matted, and the fullers would spend hours in the cold, wet vats, their feet pruned and sore. The smell of wet wool and the earth from the fulling pits would cling to their skin, leaving them with a scent that lingered long after the day's work was done. It was not a glamorous job by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, it was a profession that was often associated with a certain level of grime and discomfort, one that few would envy. Yet, as with many trades that are often dismissed as unremarkable, the fuller's role was essential to the functioning of medieval society. Their labor allowed wool to be transformed into clothing that was not only practical, but also a symbol of status. Wealthier individuals wore fine woolen garments, and these garments, now smooth and soft thanks to the fulling process, were a sign of their social standing. While the wealthy could afford the finished product, it was the fuller's dirty, labor-intensive work that made such luxuries possible, as the fullers worked tirelessly in their workshops or along riverbanks. Did they ever consider how their efforts would shape society? Did they take pride in the fact that without them, medieval society would be far less comfortable or less stylish? It is hard to say, but one thing is certain. The fuller's role, though often overlooked, was integral to the functioning of the medieval economy and culture. So, the next time you think of the clothes you wear, consider the fuller's work an unsung profession that took place behind the scenes, quite literally stamping the fabric of medieval life into place. Did the fullers ever realize how critical their role was to the people who wore their woolens? Did they feel the weight of their contribution to society, even as they slogged through cold vats and harsh work hours? As the fulling process continued, it evolved into a more refined art, shifting from the crude methods of early medieval times to a practice that became somewhat more sophisticated as towns grew and the demand for finer clothing increased. By the late medieval period, fullers played an even more integral role in the textile industry, transforming not just the texture of the wool, but also its social significance. One of the key shifts in the fulling industry came in the form of new techniques and tools. While foot-powered vats remained the standard, many fullers began incorporating more advanced methods, such as the use of fulling mills. These mills, powered by water, replaced the need for fullers to stamp the cloth by foot, making the process more efficient and allowing for greater consistency in the finished fabric. In areas where rivers were abundant, these mills could be found at the heart of textile production. Large wooden hammers would pound the wet wool, compacting it with greater force and speed than any human foot could manage, while the work itself remained largely the same, stomping, pounding, and cleaning. The scale at which it was done grew exponentially. Fulling mills could process larger quantities of wool, leading to an increase in both the volume of cloth produced and its quality. With this increase in quality came greater demand. The fuller's role evolved from a simple craftsperson into a key player in a growing economy of trade, especially in towns where textile production was central to the local economy. Towns like Florence, Ghent, and Flanders became famous for their woolen goods, and fullers in these areas were essential to the success of their local economies. For the fullers working in these towns, however, the rewards were not necessarily lavish, though they were vital to the production of high quality woolen fabrics. The job itself remained largely uncelebrated. Fullers, while respected for their skill, were often not seen in the same light as the weavers or merchants who sold the finished product. The social prestige associated with textile production was usually attributed to the wealthier clients who purchased the final garments rather than the workers who made them possible. This paradox was central to the fuller's experience. They were responsible for making woolen cloth wearable, functional, and even fashionable, yet their status was still that of an artisan, performing grueling, sometimes unsavory labor. The work of the fuller was also deeply tied to the religious and social structures of the time. Fullers, particularly those working in monasteries or ecclesiastical establishments, had to adhere to strict schedules. In many cases, the fulling process was conducted in facilities attached to monastic orders, where religious figures oversaw the trade, ensuring that wool was processed according to religious guidelines. The fullers themselves would often work in close proximity to these spiritual leaders. Though the two classes remained distinctly separate, despite the backbreaking nature of the work, fullers were essential in the creation of cloth that conveyed status. Fine woolens, once full of dirt and unpleasant oils, would now be transformed into soft, thick fabrics that adorned the wealthiest of people. As medieval towns grew in size and importance, these cloths would be exported across Europe. The rich and powerful sought after garments that conveyed wealth and prestige. The fuller's job, while often seen as mundane and gritty, had a hand in creating the luxury items that people desired most. Yet, there remained something ironic in all of this. While the fuller's labor produced the cloth that would go on to adorn kings, queens, and merchants, their work continued to be a quiet, humble affair. There was no glamour in standing in a cold vat, wet wool clinging to your legs as you pounded away. There was no pride in the smell of wet, rotting wool that would cling to a fuller's skin. The irony was not lost on those who worked the trade, though the result of their labor was valuable. Their daily experience was anything but, and perhaps this irony is what makes the fuller's story so poignant. While their work was integral to the making of the medieval economy, they were rarely acknowledged. The fine woolen garments that adorned the nobility were a testament to the skill of the fullers, yet they themselves often remained in the shadows. In fact, their labor was so intertwined with everyday life that it went largely unnoticed. The same hands that labored to make the wool soft and smooth were, in many cases, never thanked for their contributions. The fuller's work became almost invisible to society, despite its immense importance. In reflecting on this, one must wonder how many of the professions of the past have gone similarly unnoticed. How many workers toiled away, not seeking recognition or fame, but contributing silently to the grandeur of society. The fuller's role is, in this sense, a reminder that behind every luxury or accomplishment in history lies an unseen labor force working diligently in the background. Would the world have been the same without them? Or is it possible that the most boring and dirty professions are actually the ones that hold the key to society's advancement? As the 16th century progressed, the fuller's role in society began to diminish in both scale and significance. With the rise of larger, more sophisticated manufacturing processes and the increasing availability of textiles from different parts of the world, the once central role of the fuller began to fade. The craft of fulling, which had been so crucial to the production of woolen garments, was now relegated to the past, overtaken by industrial advancements that made the fuller's job not only obsolete, but also nearly forgotten in the grand sweep of history. The shift from traditional, manual fulling to more mechanized methods was not sudden, but rather a gradual process that unfolded over centuries. It began with the growth of textile mills during the Renaissance, as advances in water wheel technology and the development of mechanical hammers allowed for mass production in ways that had never been possible before. These mills, which used powerful water-driven machines to pound the cloth and remove impurities, gradually displaced the need for the foot-powered methods that had defined fulling for centuries. As the Industrial Revolution took hold in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the process of fulling was mechanized further. Large-scale factories were constructed, powered by steam engines and later electricity, which could process textiles far more quickly and efficiently than any human or animal labor could. The fuller's job, which had once been performed by individuals or small guilds working in quiet workshops or near riverbanks, was now relegated to machines in vast, noisy factories. The shift was dramatic, as entire towns that had once been built around the textile trade found themselves facing new economic realities. This change came with both positive and negative consequences. On one hand, the mechanization of textile production increased the availability and affordability of woolen goods, allowing for mass production and distribution across the globe. Garments became more accessible to the general population, and the economies of entire regions, such as England's wool industry, flourished as a result. Factories replaced the smaller workshops, and new jobs were created in the burgeoning industrial sector. However, the human cost of this transition was significant. The small, skilled fulling workshops that had employed families and local artisans gave way to factory systems that often exploited workers. In the new industrial era, fullers, along with many other skilled tradesmen, were displaced. They found themselves without work, replaced by machines that could do the same job in less time and with greater efficiency. The harsh realities of factory labor, with long hours and low pay, stood in stark contrast to the relatively independent and often more dignified work that many artisans had known before. But while the fuller's profession slowly disappeared, the legacy of their work lived on and in the fabrics that continued to shape society. The fine woolens that fullers had worked on so diligently for centuries were now mass-produced. But the process that had once been so painstaking and intimate was now reduced to a mechanical function. The fuller's role in society, once so critical, was now seen as a quaint relic of the past. By the late 19th century, the fuller's profession was largely forgotten by the general population. The word fuller itself became a term associated with outdated manual labor, something of a curiosity in the modern industrial world. Yet, this trade, like so many others lost to industrialization, had played an essential role in shaping the world of clothing and textiles as we know it today. The fuller's labor had transformed a rough, scratchy material into something comfortable and desirable They had been a quiet, almost invisible force in the development of fashion and the textile industry. And yet, despite their invisibility in the modern age, the Fullers' work was far from insignificant. Their contribution to the history of textiles and to society remains an essential chapter in the story of human progress. For without their painstaking labor, society's luxury fabrics, its finest woolens, would never have achieved the refinement that allowed for the social stratification that defined medieval life. It was the fuller's work that allowed the clothing of the wealthy to retain its softness and durability, making it a symbol of status and power. In this way, the fuller's humble, often unsung work directly influenced the rise of class systems and the material culture of the time. As we reflect on the history of the fulling trade, we can't help but wonder, what will future generations look back on and remember as the work of our own time? What professions, now invisible or underappreciated, will historians uncover and recognize as pivotal to the development of society? Perhaps we, too, are living in an age where many of our essential yet unnoticed trades will eventually be replaced, and their importance only realized long after they have passed into history. The town crier. In medieval towns and villages, news did not travel as quickly as it does today. The concept of a 24-hour news cycle was unheard of, and information spread at the pace of horse and rider or the occasional messenger. The most effective method of public communication in these communities, particularly in the bustling streets of towns, was the town crier. This seemingly mundane profession was vital to the functioning of society, and yet it remains one of the most overlooked jobs in history. The role of the town crier was to announce news, proclamations, and events to the general public. They were the central figure in a town's communication system, standing at the heart of the marketplace or in the town square to shout the latest decrees or news. These announcements could range from royal proclamations, local ordinances, or church messages to more mundane matters like market prices, upcoming fairs, or the arrival of a visiting dignitary. The crier's job was not just about speaking, but about projecting their voice loud enough to reach the farthest corners of the market, often over the din of vendors hawking their wares, animals bleating, and the general hum of village life. The town crier would stand tall, often holding a bell to draw attention before announcing the latest news. His voice, trained to be clear and powerful, was a lifeline to the community, delivering information to a largely illiterate population who could not read newspapers or signs. The position of the town crier was one of both authority and an entertainment. While the role was considered humble, town criers were often respected for their ability to captivate an audience and deliver information effectively. In a time when literacy was rare, the crier was the human connection to the outside world. For many, the crier's announcement was the only way to know what was happening beyond the walls of their village or town. It was their job to announce everything from the mundane, like the price of bread, to the vital, such as warnings of war or plague. They were, in a sense, the breaking news of their day. But the town crier's work was not always so glamorous. The profession was largely underappreciated, and its practitioners often found themselves at the mercy of those in power. Their messages, while important, were often dictated by the ruling authorities or the church. While the crier might have had the power to captivate an audience, they had little say in what news was delivered. Their role was to speak, not to decide the message. The content of their announcements was often controlled by the local lord, church officials, or the monarchy, leaving the crier with little room to stray from the script. The crier's voice would often echo through the town, but it was only for a brief moment. Once the announcement was made, the crowd dispersed and life continued on. For the crier, the job was repetitive, with each new day bringing a new proclamation to be announced. However, in those few moments when they stood before the townspeople, there was a sense of power in their voice, a fleeting moment of control over the flow of information. While their work may seem trivial in today's digital age, the town crier was far from inconsequential. Their job was a vital link in the chain of communication, and without them, towns and villages would have struggled to maintain the level of cohesion and organization that they did. The town crier's profession was indispensable, and without them, society as it was known in the medieval world would have been far more fragmented and isolated. But did the town crier ever dream of being more than just the voice of the town? Did they ever wonder if there was more to their role than simply echoing the words of the powerful? Could they have seen the town crier's job as a stepping stone to something greater? Or were they content to stand, bell in hand, shouting the news of the day for all to hear? As the 15th century progressed, the role of the town crier grew increasingly complex, reflecting not just the mundane needs of communication, but also the political and social dynamics of the time. The crier's voice, once simply a herald of local events, became an instrument in the hands of rulers, clergy, and merchants. It was no longer just a matter of reading aloud the town's happenings, but also conveying messages of power, control, and influence, especially during times of turmoil or change. The job of the town crier was particularly perilous during times of political unrest. Rulers, whether kings or local lords, often used the crier to communicate royal decrees or punishments, sometimes in the form of public shaming when a new law was introduced or a punishment was to be meted out. The town crier was there, standing in the square with the power to invoke fear as much as to inform. It wasn't unusual for a crier to announce the public executions or the imprisonment of local rebels, which served not only as an informational announcement, but also as a display of authority. The message was clear. Obedience to the law was mandatory, and the punishment for disobedience could be swift and public. Yet, the crier was also a figure of immense responsibility. Their voice had the power to shape the perceptions of an entire town. A poorly timed announcement or a misinterpreted decree could have serious consequences. For example, if a crier failed to convey the importance of a local emergency, such as a fire or a plague, the results could be disastrous. People relied on the crier for not just the usual news of markets or festivals, but for vital information that could save lives. The crier's misstep could mean a deadly miscommunication. The stakes were especially high during times of war or crisis. In medieval towns and cities, where rumors and half-truths spread quickly, the crier was often called upon to quell panic and confusion, providing the public with a sense of clarity amid chaos. When an army approached or when a siege was imminent, the crier became the calm voice that warned of danger and prepared the people for what lay ahead. The message, whether it was a call to arms or a plea for patience, had to be delivered with certainty. Town criers who failed to deliver these urgent messages correctly could be held accountable for the results of their actions, sometimes facing punishment themselves for spreading fear or confusion. In many ways, the town crier was a professional performer, skilled in the art of rhetoric and persuasion. They had to know how to deliver a message to its fullest impact. The delivery was as important as the content. The crier would often use a bell or a drum to draw attention, followed by a brief but impactful statement that would echo through the streets. Their tone, volume, and cadence were all carefully calibrated to elicit the right response. They had to strike the balance between command and reassurance, especially when announcing something as serious as the arrival of a royal tax collector or the discovery of a dangerous criminal. But despite the centrality of their role in the community, town criers lived precarious lives. They were both revered and feared, a paradox in the way they were both integral to public life and yet vulnerable to the whims of those in power. The crier had little control over the content of their proclamations and could be the target of public ire if the message they delivered was unpopular. For example, when a new tax was imposed or unpopular laws were enforced, the crier was the one tasked with delivering the news to the masses. In these cases, they often bore the brunt of the villagers' frustration, facing jeers and, at times, outright hostility. In addition to this, town criers were often at risk of becoming targets of violence, particularly in unstable political climates. In moments of political upheaval, when a town was overtaken by rival factions, or in times of civil unrest, the town crier could be seen as a symbol of the status quo. This meant they were sometimes at risk of being attacked or even killed. The town crier's profession, thus, was not only one of communication, but of survival. Every announcement they made carried with it the potential for retribution, either from those in power or from the masses who felt oppressed by the news being delivered. But did the town crier ever stop to think about the cost of their work? Did they ever reflect on the power of their voice and its ability to influence not just the lives of individuals, but the course of events? Could they have foreseen how their profession, so dependent on public perception, would be rendered obsolete in the coming centuries? The introduction of printed newspapers, after all, would gradually diminish the role of the town crier, replacing the live voice with the written word. In some ways, the crier's power was ephemeral, reliant on their moment in the spotlight, but not lasting beyond the ringing of the bell. Yet, as time passed and the world shifted, one cannot help but wonder if there was a deeper connection between the role of the crier and the role of modern-day communicators. Today, the media, whether through television, radio, or the internet, has become the new town crier, carrying news across the globe with the same sense of authority and urgency. But as we move further into the digital age, we may ask ourselves, are we losing something in the process? The immediacy, the humanity, and the intimacy of the town crier's voice are things that can't be fully replicated in our fast-paced, impersonal world of digital communication. By the 19th century, the role of the town crier began to fade almost completely from public life, as newspapers, pamphlets, and other forms of printed communication replaced the need for spoken announcements. The rapid growth of the printing press and the development of a literate public meant that information could be shared more efficiently and with greater reach. The importance of the town crier, once so central to the function of daily life, was now diminished. As industrialization took hold, cities grew larger and societies became more complex. The once small towns and villages, where the crier could command the attention of the public, expanded into bustling urban centers where the rapid spread of news was required. The written word, now easily mass produced, provided the means for information to be disseminated across much wider areas, eliminating the need for a crier to physically shout out news in every town square. Yet, even as their profession disappeared, the town crier left behind an indelible mark on the public imagination. They had been among the first to embody the idea of the messenger, the conduit through which important, urgent news passed into the consciousness of the people. Their voice had carried the weight of authority and had shaped the very fabric of community life. The crier had been more than just a bearer of news. They were the connection to a world beyond the walls of the town, a symbol of communication and the lifeblood of public awareness. The symbolic power of the crier's role can still be seen today, though the physical profession itself no longer exists in the same form. In modern society, the digital news cycle, complete with its own figures of authority and urgency, takes the place of the crier. The immediacy and frequency of modern media reflect, in many ways, the same dynamic that the town crier embodied. A swift dissemination of information meant to alert and engage the public. However, unlike the town crier, who often spoke directly to the community, the modern media tends to speak at us from a distance through screens and broadcasts. While the function of the town crier has been replaced by written and broadcasted media, there is something fundamentally human about their position. The town crier was not just a mouthpiece for the ruling classes, but a living, breathing figure whose presence made the news feel immediate. They made the world feel smaller, more connected. Their bell was a signal that something important was being shared, a ritual of communication that became embedded in the rhythms of life. And so, while the town crier may no longer stand in the marketplace with a bell in hand, their legacy lives on in every news broadcast, every bulletin, and in every headline that demands our attention. The very act of calling attention to something is a direct descendant of the crier's role in society, and in this way, the past echoes through our present. But as we move further into an age dominated by digital technology, we must ask ourselves, have we lost something in the process of this evolution? The town crier, with their commanding presence and personal connection to the community, represented something more than just the delivery of information. They embodied a sense of shared purpose and the communal act of receiving news. In the age of constant digital information, is there still space for that human connection, or has the overwhelming speed and anonymity of modern communication taken away something irreplaceable? The town crier may no longer stand in the square, but their role in shaping the flow of information and the sense of community they fostered remains a significant, albeit overlooked, part of history. The chandler, in a time before electricity illuminated the streets at night and centralized heating systems kept homes warm in the winter, the chandler was a vital part of daily life. The profession of the chandler, someone who made and sold candles and soap, was perhaps one of the most essential, yet mundane, jobs of the medieval and early modern periods. Without their work, people would have been left in the dark, both literally and figuratively. The chandler's primary role was to create candles. In a world where daylight hours were limited and many activities required the use of light, candles were indispensable. They were used in homes, churches, and public places to extend the working day after the sun had set. However, the process of making candles was far from simple. It involved a great deal of craftsmanship and knowledge of materials, as well as a thorough understanding of how to work with the natural resources available. Candles were made primarily from tallow, a form of rendered animal fat, or from beeswax, a much more expensive material reserved for the wealthy or for use in churches. Tallow was more common in everyday households, and its production began with slaughtered animals. The fat was carefully rendered by boiling it, after which it could be used to form candles. To make a candle, the chandler would dip a wick into the melted fat, repeatedly dipping and cooling it until the candle had achieved the desired thickness. This process was labor intensive and often done in large quantities, as the demand for candles was constant. While tallow candles were functional, they were often smelly, and the smoke they emitted was thick and unpleasant. On the other hand, beeswax candles were cleaner, burned more brightly, and produced less smoke, but their production was expensive and thus limited to those who could afford them. The chandler, therefore, had to be knowledgeable not just about the materials they worked with, but also about the varying preferences of their customers. Some wanted the cheaper tallow candles for everyday use, while others sought the more refined beeswax candles for special occasions. The life of a chandler was one of routine and skill. The process of rendering tallow, melting it, and carefully crafting each candle was a time-consuming endeavor, but it was essential work. In addition to making candles, many chandlers also produced soap, which was another vital commodity in the medieval world. Soap was made by mixing animal fat or vegetable oils with alkali and water. This simple yet effective mixture was used for cleaning, and the chandler's soap often became an essential household item for families across the region. Just as with candles, the chandler was at the heart of making everyday life possible. But despite the importance of their work, chandlers were rarely given the recognition they deserved. While the wealthy may have used candles in their grand homes, the chandler's work was often hidden behind the scenes, unappreciated by those who benefited from it. Yet the role of the chandler was central to the rhythms of medieval society, providing light during the long winter months and helping to maintain hygiene in a time before modern plumbing and sanitation. As the chandler worked to create these essential products, they were also tied to the ebb and flow of seasonal life. In the winter months, the demand for candles was at its peak, as longer nights required more light. In contrast, during the warmer months, the demand for candles decreased, but the chandler's work did not cease. Instead, it shifted toward the production of soap, as families prepared for the summer months when bathing was considered an essential practice for cleanliness. Yet, while the chandler's work may have seemed ordinary, their role was anything but. They were essential to the maintenance of daily life, providing the light and cleanliness necessary for people to function. It is easy to overlook the chandler in the grand sweep of history, but their work, though simple, formed the very foundation upon which other activities were built. Without the chandler's candles and soap, daily life would have been far less comfortable, far less organized. But what of the chandler themselves? Did they ever feel a sense of pride in their work? Were they aware of just how essential their craft was to society? Or were they simply focused on the repetitive nature of the task, making candle after candle, bar after bar of soap, without considering the greater implications of their labor? Did they wonder how their humble trade would be remembered, if it was remembered at all? As time passed and society advanced, the chandler's work began to shift in response to changing technology and the evolving needs of society. The introduction of new materials, the rise of commerce, and the development of urban centers led to changes in how candles and soap were produced and consumed. The chandler's role, while still central to daily life, began to evolve as new innovations gradually altered their craft. By the 17th and 18th centuries, as cities grew and trade networks expanded, chandlers began to diversify their offerings. With the increasing availability of imported materials like palm oil and stearin, a solid fat derived from animal tallow, chandlers gained access to new resources that allowed them to produce better burning candles. The use of stearin revolutionized candle making. It was a more refined fat, which produced a cleaner burn and was less prone to dripping compared to tallow. With the advent of these new materials, candles became more durable, more efficient, and more pleasing to use. This innovation began to make candles more affordable and accessible, and thus their consumption became more widespread. In addition to producing higher quality candles, chandlers also began to experiment with different shapes and sizes of candles. Previously, candles were typically just simple, straight cylinders, but with new materials at their disposal, chandlers began to create candles in various forms, thick and thin, long and short. These new varieties made candles more versatile and allowed for more creative uses. Candles were now not just functional objects, they had become decorative pieces, enhancing the ambiance of homes and public spaces. The rise of urbanization played a significant role in transforming the chandler's business. As cities became more crowded and industrialized, people sought ways to illuminate their homes and businesses more efficiently. Gas lamps, which started becoming available in the early 19th century, began to replace candles for street lighting, dramatically changing the demand for candles. Candles were still necessary for homes, but their use began to shift away from public lighting to a more private and decorative role. In wealthier homes, candles were now seen as status symbols, placed on fine dinner tables, in drawing rooms, and on mantels, their soft glow a symbol of refinement and elegance. The development of new, more efficient lighting sources like gas and, later, electricity marked the slow decline of the chandler's dominance. By the late 19th century, gas lamps in streets and homes, followed by the introduction of electric lighting, rendered candles largely obsolete for general lighting. Despite this, the chandler's legacy remained embedded in society, particularly in the realm of luxury, where fine candles continued to serve as symbols of wealth and taste. Chandlers adapted, turning their craft to meet the new demands of their clients. The production of soap also evolved significantly during this time. Early medieval soap was often crude, made by mixing fats and ashes. But by the 18th and 19th centuries, soap became a more refined product, crafted with added fragrances and specialized ingredients. The development of commercial soap factories, which could produce soap on a much larger scale, took the place of the small, handmade bars produced by individual chandlers. However, chandlers still continued to make soap in smaller batches, catering to a market that valued artisanal, high quality products. Soap was now a symbol of cleanliness and personal care, and the once humble soap bars became a luxury commodity in certain circles. Despite the industrialization of both candle and soap production, the chandler retained a place in society for the wealthy. The production of high end, decorative candles, often scented and beautifully molded, became a niche market. The demand for scented candles, for example, skyrocketed in the 19th century as the growing middle class sought to create more comfortable, aromatic homes. Chandlers adapted to these trends, learning how to blend essential oils with the wax and experimenting with new fragrances to meet the desires of an emerging consumer market. But what did this transformation mean for the original chandler, who had once toiled over the process of hand dipping candles into molten tallow? The job had changed dramatically. No longer was it a simple task of making light for a village or town. Now, it was a profession shaped by commerce, luxury, and new technologies. The chandler had become part of an industrial machine, where the focus was on efficiency, mass production, and consumer demand. As the world moved toward electric light, the practical, everyday function of candles diminished, and the chandler's work became part of a niche, more decorative industry. As the chandler's role evolved, one must consider, was this progress or loss? Were the chandlers able to preserve the artistry of their craft? Or was it diluted by the demands of mass production? The original intimacy and connection between the maker and the product, seen in the careful, hand dipped candles of the past, was replaced by factory produced goods. Yet, could it be that the craft of the chandler was never truly lost, but simply transformed into something different? Something that adapted to the changing tastes and needs of society. In this transition, the chandler left behind a profound legacy. Their skillful handling of light and warmth had once been a central part of life, but now their craft had become a luxury, a beautiful throwback to a simpler time when people looked to the flickering flame for warmth, light, and comfort. The chandler, it seems, was a master of more than just candles and soap. They were also the curators of atmosphere, the makers of moments. As the 20th century unfolded, the chandler's profession, once central to daily life, continued to evolve, but it found itself increasingly outpaced by the advancements of the modern world. With the widespread adoption of electric lighting, the chandler's role as a provider of essential illumination was almost entirely extinguished. In the face of this technological shift, candles began their slow but steady transformation into symbols of ambiance, luxury, and nostalgia. While electric light made candles obsolete for practical purposes, they found new life as decorative items. By the mid-20th century, candles were no longer used to light rooms or streets. Instead, they were reserved for special occasions: birthdays, holidays, romantic dinners, and religious ceremonies. The functional aspects of the chandler's craft were relegated to the past, but the artistic elements of candle making continued to thrive. Modern chandlers, working in the shadows of the past, began to craft decorative candles in a variety of shapes, sizes, and scents. These were not the simple, utilitarian candles of medieval times, but finely crafted objects designed to evoke a sense of elegance, comfort, and even nostalgia. With the rise of mass consumer culture, candles became accessible to people of all walks of life. While they were still used in some homes for ceremonial or religious purposes, their role had shifted to one of luxury and indulgence. The once humble tallow candles were now replaced with scented paraffin wax candles, and later, soy based candles that promised a cleaner burn and a variety of fragrances. The wax was often molded into intricate shapes, flowers, animals, and decorative forms reflecting the rise of consumer goods and the desire for personalized, aesthetically pleasing products. However, despite these innovations, the essence of the chandler's craft remained unchanged. The core of the profession, creating something that provided light, warmth, and ambiance remained the same. Modern chandlers still used time honored techniques like pouring and molding, but they adapted these methods to the tastes and preferences of contemporary society. In doing so, they ensured that candles retained their place in the home, even in the age of electric lighting. One of the most interesting developments in the modern candle industry was the rise of scented candles. These candles became more than just a source of light. They were a way to create an atmosphere. The chandler's skill expanded beyond making light to creating mood and scent. The fragrance industry began to flourish alongside the candle making industry, with scents ranging from lavender and vanilla to more exotic and complex blends. The candle became a way to engage the senses not only through the soft flicker of light, but also through the subtle, comforting aroma that filled a room. The chandler's role had shifted again, but now in a different direction, toward the creation of experiences. Candles were no longer merely practical tools, but personal indulgences. People lit candles to relax, to set a mood, or to commemorate an event. They became objects of self care, part of a ritual that involved relaxation, reflection, and even healing. Aromatherapy candles, for example, capitalized on the therapeutic qualities of certain scents, marketed as a way to alleviate stress, promote sleep, or improve concentration. Yet, with all these changes, the modern chandler's work is still closely tied to the past. The process of making a candle is still largely the same as it was hundreds of years ago, whether they are handmade by a skilled artisan or mass produced in factories. The basic principles of wax and wick, flame and warmth, remain unchanged. The same core principles that guided the chandler through the centuries are still present today. And while modern materials and techniques have introduced new possibilities, they have also preserved the essence of the craft. But the question remains, has the shift from necessity to luxury stripped the chandler of their original importance? Where once the chandler provided the very light that illuminated the lives of medieval people, they now offer a soft glow to create atmosphere or invoke emotion. The candles of today, while still providing light, are more often used to evoke warmth, comfort, and nostalgia rather than necessity. In some ways, this represents the broader shift in how we live our lives, where once basic survival dictated the course of daily life. Today, it is comfort, indulgence, and ambiance that shape our choices. In the end, while the chandler's work may not be as vital as it once was, it remains a reminder of how craftsmanship and utility can endure, even in an age of rapid technological advancement. The modern candle, despite being a far cry from its medieval ancestors, still serves a role, one that, in its own way, harks back to its roots, offering light, warmth, and a touch of comfort. The chandler's legacy is not just in the wax and wick of the candles they made, but in the way they transformed light into something more than just a physical need. In a world where the artificial light of electricity has replaced the need for their candles, the chandler's work continues, quietly and subtly, to provide the warmth and atmosphere that brings people together, offering moments of peace, reflection, and even celebration. The rat catcher. In medieval cities, where sanitation was rudimentary at best, rats were more than just a nuisance. They were a constant threat to human health. Plague, disease, and contamination often followed in their wake. And as the cities grew in size and complexity, so too did the rat population. Enter the rat catcher, a profession that might seem unremarkable at first, but was, in fact, vital to the health and safety of the medieval urban landscape. The role of the rat catcher was simple, at least in concept, to control the rodent population in cities and towns, reducing the spread of disease and preventing damage to food supplies. But the task itself was far from easy, requiring not only skill and resourcefulness, but also a certain level of bravery. The rat catcher's work was often dirty, dangerous, and thankless, yet it was crucial to the survival of urban communities. Medieval towns were not the cleanest places. Streets were often filled with refuse, animal waste, and human detritus, providing ample food and shelter for rats. The absence of effective waste disposal systems meant that rats thrived in the dense urban environment, feeding on discarded food and garbage, nesting in buildings, and even burrowing beneath the floors of homes. The rat catcher's role was to manage this growing infestation, keeping the population under control and mitigating the risk of disease transmission. But the rat catcher's work was not as straightforward as simply trapping or killing rats. It involved a variety of methods, each of which had its own challenges and dangers. In many cases, the rat catcher would use traps, simple wooden boxes, or metal cages designed to capture the animals. Other times, they might use poison, though this was a tricky method, as poisoning rats could easily lead to unintended consequences, such as poisoning other animals or even humans if the poison spread through the food supply. One of the more common methods of rat control involved using trained animals, such as ferrets or dogs, to chase the rats out of their hiding places. The ferret, in particular, was a favorite among rat catchers, as it was small enough to crawl into the tight spaces where rats often nested. The ferret's speed and agility made it an effective tool for driving rats out of places like barns, warehouses, and cellars, where they were most often found. The rat catcher, armed with traps, poison, or a trained ferret, would carefully navigate these areas, doing their best to eliminate the rodents without causing harm to the structures or the people living there. The task was not without its risks. Rats, being swift and often aggressive, could pose a significant danger to the rat catcher. In some cases, they would bite or scratch, carrying diseases that could be transmitted through their saliva or feces. Bubonic plague, spread by fleas that lived on rats, was one of the most feared diseases associated with these creatures. The rat catcher's job was, therefore, fraught with both physical and psychological dangers, as they risked exposure to illness with every interaction. Yet, despite the importance of their work, Rat catchers were not always seen in a positive light. They often worked in the shadows, outside the public eye, and their profession was considered dirty and unpleasant. People in the medieval period often associated rats with disease, filth, and death, and the rat catcher, by extension, was seen as a figure who dealt with the darker side of life. They were rarely celebrated for the vital work they did, and their role in keeping the population safe from disease was often taken for granted. The work of a rat catcher, therefore, was both essential and undervalued. It was a job that demanded skill, courage, and a willingness to work in challenging conditions. The rat catcher was an unsung hero in the urban environment, often the first line of defense against the spread of disease, yet their contribution to society went largely unnoticed. As we look back at the profession of the rat catcher, it is important to consider not just the danger they faced, but also the broader implications of their work. The rat catcher's role was central to the health of medieval cities, and without them, the spread of disease would likely have been far more rampant. Their job, though grim and unpleasant, helped to maintain some semblance of order in a world that was otherwise often on the edge of chaos. But did the rat catchers of the medieval world ever reflect on the importance of their work? Did they consider the impact they had on public health and safety? Or were they simply focused on the immediate task at hand, removing rats, one by one, without much thought for the broader implications of their labor? As the medieval period progressed, so too did the threat of disease. Among the most dreaded of these was the bubonic plague, which spread with terrifying speed through Europe. Rats, and more importantly, the fleas they carried, became a major vector for the disease. Infected fleas would bite both rats and humans, transmitting the bacteria that caused the plague. The rat catcher, therefore, found themselves at the intersection of a public health crisis and their own profession. Their work, although critical in controlling the rodent population, took on new urgency as the plague continued to ravage cities and towns. The first major outbreak of the bubonic plague in Europe occurred in the 6th century, but it was during the 14th century that the Black Death, as it came to be known, devastated much of the continent. The disease arrived in Europe through trade routes, likely carried by fleas on rats aboard ships that arrived from Asia. By the time the plague reached the densely populated cities of medieval Europe, it was too late to prevent its spread. Over the course of several years, the Black Death wiped out an estimated 1/3 of Europe's population, killing millions. The connection between rats and the spread of the plague was not fully understood at the time. People knew that rats were associated with filth and disease, but they could not yet grasp the role that the rodents and their fleas played in transmitting the bacteria. The rat catcher, though, found their job becoming increasingly difficult. As the population of rats grew in urban areas, so did the risk of disease. Rat catchers, who were already dealing with the everyday problem of keeping the rat population under control, now had to contend with a much larger and more dangerous threat: the plague. Many rat catchers during the height of the Black Death were called upon to work in areas where the disease had already taken hold. They had to navigate not only the filth of the streets, but also the uncertainty and fear that pervaded cities struck by the plague. These were dark and dangerous times, as entire neighborhoods could be wiped out in a matter of days, leaving the rat catcher to deal with the consequences of a much deadlier outbreak. Interestingly, the rat catcher's work during this period was not limited to eliminating rats. They were often involved in the broader efforts to combat the spread of the plague. In some cases, they worked alongside other professionals, such as physicians and town officials, in an attempt to quarantine areas that had been affected by the disease. They would help burn contaminated clothing, bedding, and other materials in an effort to prevent further outbreaks. In other instances, they were tasked with managing the disposal of the bodies of those who had succumbed to the plague. As much as the rat catcher's primary role remained the control of rats, they had to be adaptive in a world where every task seemed to have life or death consequences. In the face of such an overwhelming health crisis, the rat catcher became a figure of both fear and respect. Their work was seen as essential, but also as a reminder of the dangers that lurked in every corner of medieval life. While they were not fully understood or appreciated for their role in disease control, they had a unique perspective on the intersection of public health and sanitation. They were not just exterminators of pests, they were on the front lines of an invisible war against disease. But did the rat catcher ever question the limits of their work? Could they have understood the deeper connection between their labor and the greater public health crisis of the time? Were they ever frustrated by the fact that, despite their efforts, the problem of rats seemed endless, as if they were fighting an unrelenting tide of filth and disease? Could they see how their role, though often uncelebrated, was part of a much larger, more systemic problem that was beyond their control? The tragic reality for the rat catchers of the time was that their work, though vital, was often a temporary fix. As long as the conditions for rats to thrive remained, so too would the danger of disease. The medieval understanding of the rat-flea plague connection was not advanced enough to break the cycle, and even the most dedicated rat catcher could not fully rid the world of the conditions that made the rats and their fleas so dangerous. As history has shown, however, the role of the rat catcher was one that would eventually fade into obscurity. With the rise of modern sanitation, pest control, and scientific understanding, the rat catcher's work was gradually replaced by more systematic and less labor-intensive methods of pest control. The profession, which had once been vital to the survival of the medieval city, was now a distant memory, a forgotten part of a time long past. As the world entered the 19th and 20th centuries, the profession of the rat catcher began to vanish. The Industrial Revolution brought with it advancements in sanitation, which helped control the very conditions that had allowed rats to thrive in urban environments. Public health campaigns, better waste management systems, and new technologies for pest control made the work of the traditional rat catcher increasingly obsolete. The rise of modern chemicals and traps replaced the need for the manual, often dirty, and dangerous methods employed by the medieval rat catchers. However, while the profession itself may have disappeared, the rat catcher's legacy remains embedded in our modern understanding of public health. The role they played in controlling pests and managing disease was crucial to the survival of medieval communities. The plague, which took millions of lives, served as a stark reminder of the interconnection between rats, fleas, and human health. Though medieval society did not fully understand this link, the efforts of the rat catchers, as rudimentary as they were, laid the groundwork for the eventual recognition of the importance of hygiene, waste management, and pest control in preventing disease outbreaks. In modern times, rat catchers have been replaced by pest control professionals, but their work remains crucial in maintaining public health. Today, pest control experts are highly trained to deal with a variety of vermin and pests, from rats to cockroaches to termites, using more efficient and humane methods. While modern pest control methods are far more advanced than anything the medieval rat catcher could have imagined, the importance of controlling pests remains as vital as ever. Without the early efforts of rat catchers, societies would have faced even greater public health challenges, particularly in times of epidemics. Interestingly, the rat catcher's role is not entirely gone. Today, there are still those who specialize in the control of rat populations in urban environments. However, instead of using ferrets or foot traps, modern pest controllers use high-tech equipment, poisons, and bait stations. The core of the rat catcher's mission to reduce the rodent population and prevent disease transmission has not changed. It's simply been updated with better technology and a more thorough understanding of disease vectors. The profession of the rat catcher, despite its transformation, serves as a reminder of how much we depend on unseen laborers in our daily lives. Much like the medieval rat catcher, modern workers in public health, sanitation, and pest control work tirelessly behind the scenes to keep us safe and healthy. Their contributions, although often overlooked, are essential to the functioning of modern societies. But looking back at the rat catchers of the past, we can't help but wonder, what would they have thought of the modern world? Would they have been amazed by the advancements in pest control and the better understanding of disease transmission, or would they have felt a sense of pride in knowing that their work, though rudimentary, helped save lives and shaped the foundation of modern public health? The rat catcher's story is ultimately a story of perseverance, adaptability, and the importance of even the most unremarkable professions in the grand scheme of history. The work of these individuals, who faced danger, filth, and public scorn, was integral to the survival of their communities. In their hands lay the delicate balance between life and death, health and sickness. The profession may be gone, but its legacy lives on in the modern world's constant battle against pests and the diseases they carry. So, the next time we think about the forgotten professions of the past, let us remember the rat catcher not for the glamour of their work, but for their crucial role in keeping the world safe from unseen threats. They may not have had the recognition they deserved, but their contribution to society was nothing short of essential. The lamplighter, long before the invention of streetlights and the advent of electric illumination, there was a quiet, solitary figure who played a crucial role in the safety and atmosphere of the streets at night. The lamplighter. In cities across Europe and later, across the world, the lamplighter's job was one of both responsibility and routine, lighting the way for travelers and marking the hours of the night with their steady presence. The lamplighter's task was simple in theory, but far from easy. As evening fell, they would set out into the streets, carrying a long pole, often topped with a flame or wick, to ignite the oil lamps that lined the city's roads. These lamps, typically made of metal or glass, contained oil, usually whale oil or vegetable oil, that would burn throughout the night. The lamplighter's job was to light each one, ensure it was burning well, and then, at dawn, go back through the streets to extinguish the lamps before the day's light took over. This routine was essential for the safety and functionality of urban life. Before the era of electric lighting, The lamplighter was responsible for bringing light to the night, allowing people to travel safely through the streets after dark. Without this crucial service, cities would have been plunged into darkness after sunset, leaving those who needed to travel, whether merchants, travelers, or simply the evening workers, at the mercy of the night. The lamplighter was the figure who illuminated these streets, ensuring a degree of safety and comfort for the city's residents. But the lamplighter's work was not just about safety, it was also about the rhythm of life. Their work signaled the passage of time. With each lamp lit, the night's hour was marked. In some cities, the lamplighter's task was even considered a form of artistry. The gentle flickering of the oil lamps created a soothing atmosphere that defined the mood of the city after dusk. The lamplighter, with their steady movements, created a dance of light that brought both function and beauty to the streets. However, the job was not without its challenges. It required working through all weather conditions, rain, snow, or the chill of winter. The lamplighter often worked alone, walking the streets when most people were inside their homes, leaving them somewhat isolated from the rest of the community. It was a job done largely out of the public eye, yet without it, the streets would have been unrecognizable. The lamplighter ensured that the world was never truly lost to darkness, and that the rhythm of the city could continue through the night. In addition to lighting the lamps, the lamplighter was responsible for maintenance. Each lamp had to be cleaned, refilled with oil, and adjusted to ensure it continued burning brightly. This labor-intensive work required attention to detail, as even a single poorly lit lamp could make the difference between a safe passage and an accident. It was a delicate balance, where every small action had an impact on the night's environment. But for all their work, the lamplighter was not often seen as a glamorous figure. They were not heroes celebrated in song or story. Instead, they were a quiet part of the city's machinery, ensuring that the lights remained on. The job was simple, but without it, many aspects of daily life would have been severely hindered. The lamplighter was also a figure whose work symbolized the gradual shift from a world defined by natural rhythms, where day and night were dictated by the sun, to one increasingly shaped by human intervention. The oil lamps brought the artificial light of the human-made world into the natural cycle of darkness and daylight. In this way, the lamplighter was not just lighting lamps. They were marking the boundary between nature and human civilization. But perhaps the most poignant question about the lamplighter's work is whether they ever saw their job as anything more than a routine. Did they understand how essential they were to the functioning of their community? Or was it simply a job to be done, another task to be checked off before the night was over? Did they ever feel the weight of their importance, even as they silently walked the streets, lighting lamps one by one? As the 19th century progressed and cities expanded, the lamplighter's role began to evolve. The Industrial Revolution brought with it a wave of technological advancements that changed the way cities operated. The invention of gas lighting, and later, electric lighting, was the beginning of the end for the lamplighter's profession. While gas lamps were still manually lit by lamplighters at first, the increased efficiency and brightness of gas lighting meant that the number of lamps and the need for individual attention grew rapidly. Gas lighting, which emerged in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, allowed for continuous illumination without the need for daily lighting and extinguishing. Unlike oil lamps, which required constant maintenance, gas lamps could burn continuously without the need for a person to light them each evening. Gas pipelines were installed throughout cities, and the technology was quickly adopted in major urban centers. The work of the lamplighter, once crucial to the safety and ambiance of the city, now began to fade into obscurity. The lamplighter, however, was not easily replaced. The transition from oil lamps to gas lamps was gradual, and in many places, the lamplighter continued their work alongside new technologies. The profession began to shift from simply lighting the lamps to maintaining them. In some cities, lamplighters were tasked with adjusting the flow of gas, repairing lamps, and ensuring that the pipes were functioning properly. They still played a role in the city's nighttime illumination, but their job had changed. They were no longer seen as the people who brought the light every evening, but as caretakers of a new, more efficient system. Despite this shift, the lamplighters' work continued to be highly valued in cities that relied on gas lamps. Their daily routines still marked the passage of time, signaling the arrival of night and the end of the day's activities. But as cities became more modernized, the reliance on human intervention began to diminish. Gas lamps were eventually replaced by electric streetlights, which could be turned on and off automatically. The lamplighter's once proud role as the caretaker of the night was replaced by the mechanized efficiency of modern street lighting systems. By the early 20th century, the lamplighter's profession had almost entirely disappeared. In cities where gas lamps had once burned brightly, electric lights now illuminated the streets without the need for human assistance. The lamplighter's job, once a vital part of urban life, was rendered obsolete by the very technological progress they had witnessed. The lamplighter's role, once a symbol of both utility and rhythm, was now an anachronism, a forgotten part of the city's past. But did the lamplighters of the world ever imagine that their work would vanish so quickly? Could they have foreseen that their steady, routine labor would be replaced by machines that required no human touch? Were they ever able to look back and appreciate the artistry of their work? Or was it always just a job, a simple, unremarkable task that was essential, yet uncelebrated? Could they have known that, in some way, they represented the last of an era that would soon be swept away by innovation? As we reflect on the profession of the lamplighter, we are left with a sense of both nostalgia and gratitude. The lamplighter's work was symbolic of a time when human presence and an effort were essential to the functioning of the city. Their ritual of lighting lamps and marking the hours was a tangible connection between the passing of the day and the night. With the advent of modern lighting, that connection has been severed, and the lamplighter's role is no longer needed. Yet, in the glow of modern streetlights, there remains a quiet tribute to the generations of lamplighters who made cities safer and more welcoming at night. Though their work has been replaced, the lamplighters' legacy endures. The way they lit up the streets and created a rhythm of light and darkness lives on in the designs of modern cities, where streetlights continue to define the nighttime environment, while the lamplighters' manual labor is no longer required. Their contributions remain part of the city's soul, a part of history that can still be felt in the way we navigate the world after dark. As the electric age dawned, the lamplighter's job gradually faded into history, becoming just another forgotten profession. The gas lamps that once illuminated the streets were slowly replaced with electric lights, which required no human intervention to be lit or extinguished. The lamplighter, who had once been the figure responsible for marking the night, was rendered unnecessary in the age of technological advancement. Cities became brighter and more efficient, but the human touch that had once been so essential was gone. However, even as the lamplighter's profession faded, their influence lingered in unexpected ways. In many ways, the lamplighter's profession represented the transition from a more personal, human centered world to one increasingly defined by automation and industrialization. The lamplighter was part of a bygone era when people had to rely on each other for even the most basic aspects of daily life. They were the keepers of time, marking the hours with the flickering glow of their lamps. They played an active role in shaping the city's nightscape, crafting an atmosphere that was at once functional and poetic. Their disappearance marks a turning point in how we interact with our urban environments. Yet, despite the mechanization that replaced their work, the lamplighter's legacy remains deeply embedded in our cities. Street lighting, even in its modern, automated form, continues to define the rhythm of city life. The soft glow of streetlights still casts shadows and illuminates pathways, just as the lamplighter once did. And in the way cities around the world have evolved, the lamplighter's contribution remains a part of the urban fabric. While their hands no longer light the lamps, their work is still felt in the design of cities, the layout of streetlights, and the very atmosphere of urban nights. Furthermore, the lamplighter has not entirely disappeared from the public imagination. In certain cities, there are still historical reenactments or festivals where people take up the mantle of the lamplighter, reliving the traditions of a bygone age. These performances, though symbolic, serve as a reminder of a time when the act of lighting the night was a human endeavor. In some places, lamplighters even return to work, though in a ceremonial capacity, to ignite the gas lamps in historic districts, preserving the nostalgic image of the past for the public to admire. The image of the lamplighter also continues to hold symbolic value. In literature, art, and popular culture, the lamplighter often represents the steady, quiet force that brings light into the darkness, both literally and figuratively. In a world where automation and technology have disconnected many of us from the tangible, hands-on work of the past, the lamplighter stands as a symbol of human presence, care, and effort. Their work was a reminder that even in the most routine and uncelebrated professions, there is dignity and there is value in the labor that keeps our world functioning. As we look to the future, it is worth considering the legacy of the lamplighter as a metaphor for the many unnoticed workers who shape our lives. While we may no longer rely on individuals to light the streets or mark the hours of the day, there are still countless professions that, though invisible, are essential to the functioning of society. The lamplighter's legacy is not just about the work they did, but about the way their profession connects us to a deeper sense of community and continuity, a sense of rhythm and shared responsibility that transcends time. In the end, the lamplighter may have been replaced by electric lights, but their role in our cities and in our collective memory remains intact. They were the quiet custodians of the night, bringing light to the darkened streets, marking the hours, and maintaining a ritual that connected people to their environment. The lamplighter's profession may have disappeared, but the glow of their work endures, illuminating the way for those who follow. The town drummer. In medieval and early modern Europe, before the advent of mass communication or the telephone, there were few ways to disseminate important news quickly across a town. People could not simply pick up a newspaper or turn on a radio to hear the latest announcements. The role of the town drummer was central to the spread of information, serving as a living, breathing news source for the public. The town drummer was responsible for carrying the most important news through the streets, beating their drum to attract attention, whether it was an important decree from the king, an impending war, the arrival of a royal visitor, or the announcement of a festival. The town drummer was the one who made sure that everyone knew what was happening. They would march through the streets, drum in hand, creating an unmistakable sound that would alert citizens to listen carefully to the message being conveyed. The sound of the drum itself was significant. Its rhythm marked the time and set the pace for the day's activities. It was a call to attention, a signal that something of importance was being communicated. The town drummer was, in a sense, the first form of public address system, projecting news across the town square and beyond. The drumming was not just for public announcements. It was also used to signal the hours of the day. In larger cities, a drummer might be employed to mark the changing of the hours, waking people up at dawn or calling them to prayer. In some cases, the town drummer also played a role in keeping the peace. When tensions were high or a fight had broken out in the streets, a well-placed drumming could help draw attention to the situation, potentially averting further conflict. Yet, despite the importance of their work, the town drummer's life was often solitary and difficult. It was a role that demanded a certain level of skill. As the drummer, they had to learn to play in a way that could capture the attention of a large crowd and convey information clearly. They had to have stamina, as they often walked long distances through the streets. Beating the drum for hours on end, they had to be persistent, as their task was not only to gather the attention of those in the streets, but to make sure that every important message was heard. It was a thankless job in many ways, as the drummer was seldom celebrated for their role in the town's daily rhythms. The town drummer also had a somewhat precarious position. They were often working under the direct authority of town officials or nobility, and their messages were determined by those in power. While they were the conduit for news, they had little control over what that news would be. The messages were dictated to them, and they were often seen as little more than instruments for spreading decrees or orders. Yet, despite this, they were a vital part of the public communication system, and without them, much of the important information would never have reached the people. Perhaps most striking is the way in which the town drummer embodied the connection between sound and communication in a world without radios, televisions, or printed materials. Sound was the only way to carry news across a city. The drummer's beat became synonymous with the pulse of the town, and their rhythm marked the flow of time, guiding the daily lives of the people. It is said that the drum beat itself became almost synonymous with the arrival of news. People would hear the rhythmic thud and immediately know that something important was about to be announced. The town drummer may not have been as revered as other figures in medieval society, but their work was critical. They were the ones who kept the people informed, the ones who carried the heartbeat of the town through the sound of their drum in their hands. The rhythm of the day was not just a measure of time, it was the lifeline of the town's communication. But did the town drummer ever feel the weight of their role? Could they have imagined that, long after their drum beats faded from the streets, their job would be remembered as a symbol of an era where sound and rhythm were used to shape public life? Did they ever reflect on the way their drum marked the passage of time and the movement of history? Or were they simply focused on the next beat, the next announcement, the next call to attention? As the centuries passed, the role of the town drummer began to evolve. The rise of printing technology and the spread of literacy gradually made the need for oral announcements less pressing. News could now be spread through written proclamations, newspapers, and pamphlets, which eventually became the dominant means of communication in towns and cities. The town drummer, whose rhythmic drumming once commanded attention, slowly became a relic of the past. With the advent of the printing press in the 15th century, information could be disseminated more widely and efficiently. The written word, printed and distributed, became the primary means of sharing news. For the first time in history, news could reach people beyond the immediate vicinity of the town square. The drummer, who had once played such a central role in urban communication, now had to contend with a new wave of technology that made their craft obsolete. In cities where the printing press had already made an impact, the role of the town drummer became more ceremonial. Though they still performed their duties, delivering official decrees or public announcements, they were no longer the sole means of communication. People could read the same news in a newspaper or hear it broadcast on a town's public notice board. The sound of the drum was no longer needed to command the crowd's attention. Instead, it became a more theatrical element, used to create atmosphere rather than to convey information. Yet, despite the decline in their importance, town drummers still played a vital role in some communities, particularly in smaller towns and villages where access to printed materials was limited. In these places, the town drummer still made rounds through the streets, signaling the time for markets to open, for curfews to be imposed, or for events to begin. They remained a symbol of order, rhythm, and continuity in the life of the town. The rise of printed media also brought about changes in the structure of local governance. In medieval times, the town crier or drummer was often a servant of the local lord or ruler, tasked with delivering their messages. With the rise of printed communications, the power to distribute information became more decentralized. Local governments began to print their own decrees and newsletters, which could be distributed more efficiently and without the need for a human messenger. As the role of the town drummer diminished, many former drummers turned to other occupations or adopted new roles in the evolving media landscape. Some became public speakers, using their skills in rhythm and delivery to entertain or inform through performance. Others joined the expanding printing industry, using their knowledge of public communication to help in the distribution of printed news. In many ways, the transition from the drumbeat of the town drummer to the printed word represents a broader shift in how society communicated and interacted. The town drummer, with their constant presence and their ability to command attention through sound, was part of an era when information was slow to travel and controlled by the few. With the rise of the printing press, information became more accessible, and the power to communicate spread beyond the elite to the masses. The drumbeat, once a symbol of power, was now relegated to history, as the written word and later the spoken word through radio and television took its place. Yet, the town drummer's legacy persists in modern communication. The symbolism of a rhythmic beat, the attention grabbing quality of sound, continues to be used in modern media and advertising. The drum beat, once a tool for distributing news, lives on in the world of media, where sound still plays a critical role in drawing in the audience and marking the significance of an announcement. In many ways, the town drummer was a precursor to the modern public address systems and media that now command our attention. While the town drummer may have faded into history, their role in the rhythm of life, marking time, spreading news, creating atmosphere, remains a part of the modern urban experience. The drum may have been replaced by other forms of communication, but the core idea behind the lamplighters' work, the need for human connection, the need to share information and bring people together, is as relevant today as it was centuries ago. But did the town drummers themselves ever feel the shift happening? Could they have imagined a world where their drumming, so essential to their work, would no longer be needed in the same way? Were they aware that their job, once central to the structure of the community, would be replaced by new technologies that would change the way people interacted with information forever? As we look back on their work, we can't help but reflect on the rhythm of history. The drum beats that once marked the passage of time and the spread of news are now silent, but their impact lives on, shaping the way we communicate today. Although the traditional role of the town drummer has long since faded, the legacy of their work remains an integral part of modern life. In many ways, the town drummer can be seen as a precursor to the modern systems of mass communication, a symbol of how humans have always sought to share information and bring people together through sound. Today, we live in an age where communication is instantaneous, where the sound of an alarm or a ringing bell can signal breaking news, and where digital notifications are our modern-day drum beats. The rhythm of the town drummer, once a heartbeat of the community, has evolved into the buzz of smartphones, the beeps of social media notifications, and the rattle of television commercials. But in all these new forms of communication, there is a trace of the town drummer's influence, the recognition that sound can capture attention, create urgency, and shape the way we interact with the world. The town drummer's beat marked the time and kept the rhythm of the city. And even now, sound continues to play a central role in how we experience the world. Public address systems, emergency sirens, and alarm bells are direct descendants of the town drummer's call to action. Whether it's a fire alarm blaring through a building or a news anchor's urgent voice on the television, the use of sound to deliver important information has remained central to our daily lives. And like the drum beat that once signaled the arrival of a message in the medieval town, these modern-day sounds are still used to draw attention and shape our collective behavior. In a sense, the town drummer represents a broader theme of transition, from oral communication to written communication, from manual labor to mechanized systems, and from the small, local community to the sprawling global networks of today. The role of the town drummer may have been replaced by printed newspapers, radio broadcasts, and digital notifications, but their function to communicate important news remains the same. The rhythm of the drum may have been replaced by other rhythms, but the human need to stay informed, connected, and aware of the world around us has not changed. There is also a more nostalgic aspect to the town drummer's legacy. In an increasingly digital and fast paced world, we often long for the simplicity and directness of a time when news came with a personal touch. The town drummer's presence in the streets was a reminder that information was once shared in a way that felt more immediate, more connected, and perhaps more communal. Today, as we scroll through our devices, we might wonder if we've lost something in the process, the sense of anticipation, the sense that someone was out there beating a drum to bring us together and remind us of our shared humanity. Moreover, the image of the town drummer continues to evoke a sense of nostalgia and longing for a time when communities were smaller and people were more attuned to the rhythms of the day. The town drummer, in this way, symbolizes not only the spread of information, but also the connection between people, the sense that everyone in town shared in the same experience as they gathered to listen to the drumbeat. In modern storytelling, we see the town drummer reimagined in various forms: films, literature, and even historical reenactments often use the imagery of a drumbeat or a town crier to evoke a sense of the past, calling attention to the role of sound in history. In these instances, the town drummer becomes a symbol not only of the past, but of the ongoing human need to communicate, to inform, and to connect. The final echo of the town drummer's work lies in the human desire to be heard, to share knowledge, and to participate in the collective life of a community, whether through a digital notification, a public announcement, or the simple ringing of a bell. The town drummer's legacy endures. The need for communication, for sound to draw us together, for rhythm to mark our days. These are timeless desires that transcend the technology we use to fulfill them. As we reflect on the town drummer, we are reminded of the power of sound and its role in shaping the world around us. From the first beat of the drum in a medieval town to the buzzing of our phones today, the rhythm of life continues, and while the instruments may have changed, the human need for connection and communication remains constant. The drumbeat that once marked the passage of news and time still echoes in our daily lives, reminding us of the town drummers who once carried the pulse of the community through the streets. Their work may have ended, but their legacy, like the sound of their drum, remains woven into the fabric of modern life.